Martha Wilson, a 78-year-old grandmother with silver hair and kind eyes, woke up early that Tuesday morning. She carefully marked her calendar as she did every month, Pension Day. After making herself a cup of tea and feeding her cat Mittens, she put on her best cardigan and comfortable walking shoes. The bank wasn't far, just 3 blocks from her small apartment, but her arthritis made the journey feel longer these days. The spring air felt pleasant as Martha made her way down the familiar sidewalk, greeting neighbors and pausing to admire the flowers blooming in window boxes. She'd lived in this neighborhood for most of her adult life. Everyone knew Martha, from the bakery owner who saved her favorite bread to the crossing guard who always held her arm at the busy intersection. When Martha arrived at First National Bank, she sighed at the long line stretching nearly to the door. She didn't mind waiting, though. She'd been coming to this same bank every month for over 30 years, ever since her husband Tom had passed away. The routine gave her comfort. As the line inched forward, Martha noticed many new faces behind the counters. The bank had recently been bought by a larger corporation, and most of the staff she'd known for years had been replaced. She missed the friendly chats with Jennifer, who always asked about her grandchildren, or Bill, who would share stories about his garden. After nearly an hour of standing, Martha's knees ached terribly. When she finally reached the counter, a young man with a crisp new name tag greeted her without looking up from his computer. "I'd like to deposit my pension check, please," Martha said, sliding the envelope across the counter along with her bank book. The teller looked up briefly. "I'll need to see your ID, ma'am." Martha's heart sank as she reached for her purse and began searching through its contents. Her fingers trembled slightly as she checked every pocket, but her wallet was nowhere to be found. With embarrassment washing over her, she realized she must have left it on her kitchen table in her rush to catch the morning bus. "I'm so sorry, dear. I seem to have forgotten my ID at home, but I've been banking here for over 30 years. Perhaps you could make an exception just this once. It's quite painful for me to make the trip twice in one day." The young teller's expression hardened. "I'm sorry, but it's bank policy. No ID, no transaction. Those are the rules." His voice carried across the quiet bank floor, causing several people to turn and look. Martha lowered her voice. "Could I possibly speak to someone who knows me? Maybe Dorothy? She usually works Tuesdays." "Dorothy doesn't work here anymore," he replied tersely, before calling out, "Next customer, please." Martha didn't move. "Please, I really need to deposit this check today. My rent is due tomorrow." The teller sighed loudly and pressed a button under his counter. Moments later, a woman in a sharp suit approached. "Is there a problem here?" "This lady wants to make a transaction without ID." "I told her it's against policy," the teller explained. The manager turned to Martha with an impatient expression. "Ma'am, we can't bend the rules, even for long-time customers. You'll need to come back with proper identification." Martha's eyes welled with tears. "I understand rules, but surely there must be some way to verify who I am. I've been coming here since. If you can't produce identification, I'll have to ask you to leave," the manager interrupted. "You're holding up the line." Martha stood her ground, her dignity fighting against the humiliation. "Please just check your records. Martha Wilson, I've had the same account since 1989. The manager's patience visibly thinned. She motioned to a security guard standing near the door. "Please escort this woman out." Several customers in line watched in disbelief as the guard approached Martha. With gentle hands but firm intention, he took her elbow and began guiding her toward the exit. Martha's cheeks burned with embarrassment as whispers rippled through the bank. The security guard, a tall man with a sympathetic expression, walked Martha toward the bank's glass doors. She felt every eye in the building on her back as she clutched her pension check and her empty purse. This wasn't just about a banking transaction anymore, it was about her dignity. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the guard whispered as they reached the exit. "I'm just doing my job." Martha nodded, understanding his position, though her heart felt heavy. As the doors closed behind her, she stood on the sidewalk, unsure what to do next. The 3-block walk home felt impossible now, her knees still aching from standing in line. Her rent was due tomorrow, and without this deposit, she might be late for the first time in decades. She made her way slowly to a public bench near the bank entrance and sat down, trying to gather her thoughts. The spring breeze that had felt so pleasant earlier now chilled her to the bone. Inside the bank, a young man named James Hernandez witnessed the entire scene. James taught 4th grade at the local elementary school and had just finished helping with morning crossing guard duty. He had only stopped by the bank to deposit a check before heading to school. James had watched uncomfortably as the situation with Martha unfolded. When he saw the elderly woman being escorted out, something inside him snapped. This wasn't right. He'd been raised by his grandmother after his parents died, and seeing an older woman treated this way struck a personal chord. James pulled out his phone and began recording as the security guard led Martha to the door. He captured the manager's cold expression and the uncomfortable glances of other customers. As Martha sat alone on the bench outside, James quickly finished his transaction and hurried up to check on her. "Excuse me," he said gently, approaching the bench. "Are you okay? I saw what happened in there." Martha looked up, embarrassment still coloring her cheeks. "Oh, I'm fine, dear. Just catching my breath before I head back home." James sat down beside her. "My name is James. I teach at Oakwood Elementary. What they did in there wasn't right." "It's their policy," Martha said with resignation. "I should have remembered my ID." "Policy or not, there are ways to verify identity without humiliating someone," James replied. "Would you mind telling me your name?" "Martha Wilson," she said, offering a small smile. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 45 years. James nodded and took a deep breath. "Ms. Wilson, I recorded what happened in there. With your permission, I'd like to post it online. People should see how this bank treats its elderly customers." Martha hesitated. She'd never been one to cause trouble or draw attention to herself. But something about the day's events, the coldness of the staff, the feeling of being invisible despite her decades of loyalty, made her nod in agreement. "If you think it might help others avoid what happened to me, then yes." James helped Martha to her feet. "Let me walk you home first. Then I'll make sure people hear about this." As they walked slowly down the sidewalk, Martha told James about how the bank had changed since the corporate takeover. How the friendly faces she'd known for years had disappeared, replaced by people who seemed more concerned with rules than relationships. When they reached Martha's apartment building, James made sure she got inside safely. "I'll check on you tomorrow, Ms. Wilson. And I promise someone will hear about what happened today." That evening, after finishing his school day, James uploaded the video to his social media accounts. He added a thoughtful caption explaining Martha's situation. A 78-year-old widow, a 30-year customer of the bank, turned away because she forgot her ID once in 3 decades of banking there. "This isn't about breaking necessary security protocols," James wrote. "It's about treating people with dignity and finding solutions instead of creating problems. First National Bank, do better." Before going to bed, James checked his phone. The video had a few hundred views, more than his posts usually got, but nothing extraordinary. He hoped it might reach someone at the bank who could make things right for Martha. What James didn't know was that overnight, his post would catch fire. By morning, it would be shared thousands of times, each share bringing more outrage, more comments, and more attention to Martha's story. And among those who would see it was someone with both the platform and the heart to do something about it, someone who never ignored injustice when he saw it. James woke up the next morning and reached for his phone, still groggy from sleep. His eyes widened as notifications flooded his screen. The video of Martha at the bank had exploded overnight. What had been a few hundred views when he went to bed had transformed into over 200,000, and the numbers were climbing by the minute. He sat up in bed, scrolling through comments. People from across the country were expressing outrage at how Martha had been treated. Many shared similar stories of elderly relatives being humiliated by rigid corporate policies. Others who identified themselves as bank employees chimed in, explaining that there were indeed protocols for helping long-time customers who occasionally forgot their ID. "This bank should be ashamed," read one comment with thousands of likes. "That could have been my grandmother." James quickly got dressed and headed to school, but his phone kept buzzing throughout the morning. Local news outlets had started reaching out, asking for permission to share the video. By lunchtime, a reporter from the city newspaper was waiting in the school office to speak with him. "I didn't do this for attention," James explained to the reporter. "I just couldn't stand by and watch someone being treated that way." After school, James walked to Martha's apartment to check on her. She greeted him at the door with a warm smile and a plate of homemade cookies. "Come in, dear. I've been getting the strangest phone calls all day. People saying they saw me on the internet. I don't even have a computer." James accepted a cookie and sat down at Martha's kitchen table. "The video I took yesterday has gone viral, Ms. Wilson. That means a lot of people have seen it. They're upset about how the bank treated you." Martha looked concerned. "Oh my, I hope nobody gets in trouble." "It's not about getting people in trouble," James explained gently. "It's about making things right." As they talked, neither knew that across town, in a luxury hotel gym, someone else had just watched the video, someone whose massive frame was currently lifting weights that would challenge most professional athletes. Shaquille O'Neal wiped sweat from his brow and watched the clip again on his phone. Something about the elderly woman's dignity in the face of humiliation struck him deeply. Shaq had grown up not far from this neighborhood before basketball had taken him to fame and fortune. He recognized the bank. His mother had used it when he was a kid. "Hey, Rod," Shaq called to his assistant, "find out where this lady lives, and get me the number for the regional director of that bank." Across the city, Martha was becoming a reluctant celebrity. Her phone rang constantly with calls from reporters and concerned citizens. By evening, a small crowd had gathered outside her apartment building, some holding signs supporting her and criticizing the bank. "This is all too much fuss," Martha told James as they peeked through her curtains at the growing crowd. "I just wanted to deposit my check." "People connect with your story," James explained. "It reminds them of their own parents and grandparents. Nobody wants to see an elder treated disrespectfully." The next morning, Martha's story led the local news. The bank issued a carefully worded statement about reviewing the incident and commitment to customer service, but the damage to their reputation was spreading. Hashtags like #JusticeForMartha and #RespectTourElders were trending on social media platforms. Martha tried to go about her normal routine, but found it difficult with reporters waiting outside her building. She missed her weekly trip to the grocery store, afraid of the attention. Her neighbor brought her bread and milk, but Martha felt like a prisoner in her own home. "This isn't what I wanted," she confided to James over the phone. "I just needed to deposit my check. Now I can't even leave my apartment." James felt a pang of guilt. Had he made things worse for Martha by posting the video? He was considering how to help when his phone rang, an unknown number. "Hello, is this James Hernandez?" asked a deep voice that somehow sounded familiar. "Yes, speaking." "This is Shaquille O'Neal. I saw your video of what happened to that elderly lady at the bank." James nearly dropped his phone. "Shaq, the Shaquille O'Neal?" A warm chuckle came through the phone. "The one and only. Listen, I want to help make this right. Can you connect me with Martha? I've got some ideas, but I need to speak with her first." James could hardly believe what he was hearing. One of the greatest basketball players of all time, known almost as much for his heart as for his athletic prowess, wanted to help Martha. Of course, James managed to say, "I'll call her right now and see if she's comfortable with me sharing her number." As James ended the call, he stared at his phone in disbelief. What had started as a simple act of standing up for someone had snowballed into something he never could have imagined. And somehow, Shaquille O'Neal was now involved. Whatever happened next, James' new life for Martha Wilson was about to change dramatically. The next morning, Martha sat at her kitchen table sipping tea, still trying to process her conversation with Shaquille O'Neal from the night before. The basketball legend had been so kind on the phone, his deep voice warm and respectful as he introduced himself. "Ms. Wilson, I saw what happened to you at that bank, and it wasn't right," he had told her. "My mama raised me better than to stand by when I see someone being disrespected, especially an elder." Martha had been speechless at first. Celebrities didn't call people like her. But Shaq's genuine concern had quickly put her at ease. "I appreciate your kindness, Mr. O'Neal, but you really don't need to worry about me," she had replied. "Please call me Shaq. And I'm not just worried, I want to help. Would it be okay if I came by tomorrow morning? No cameras, no publicity. Just you and me having a conversation about how to make this right." Now, as Martha waited for his arrival, she couldn't help feeling nervous. She'd changed her outfit 3 times already. What does one wear to meet a basketball superstar? She finally settled on a simple blue dress she wore to church, dignified but not pretentious. At precisely 10 a.m., a gentle knock came at her door. Martha took a deep breath and opened it, only to find herself looking directly at a belt buckle. She slowly tilted her head up and up until she finally met the smiling face of Shaquille O'Neal, who had to duck slightly to fit in her doorway. "Ms. Wilson," he said warmly, extending an enormous hand. "It's an honor to meet you." "The honor is mine," Martha replied, her hand disappearing into his massive palm. "Please come in, though you might need to watch your head." Shaq laughed and carefully navigated through Martha's apartment, looking almost comically large among her delicate furniture. He settled carefully onto her sofa, which seemed to shrink beneath his frame. "I made some cookies," Martha offered, bringing over a plate. "My grandson says they're the best in the world, but he might be biased." Shaq took a cookie and bit into it. "Your grandson's right. These are amazing." For the next hour, they talked like old friends. Martha shared stories about growing up during simpler times, when banks knew their customers by name. Shaq told her about his mother and grandmother, who had taught him the importance of respecting elders. "Here's what I'm thinking," Shaq finally said, leaning forward. "Tomorrow morning, I'd like to take you back to that bank. Not for revenge or to make a scene, but to show them there's a better way to treat people who've been loyal customers for decades." Martha hesitated. "I don't want anyone to lose their job." "That's not my goal either," Shaq assured her. "My goal is to change how they think about their policies and their customers. Sometimes big corporations forget that behind every account number is a real person with real feelings." After thinking it over, Martha nodded. "All right, but no cameras or reporters. I don't need to be on television." "Deal," Shaq said with a smile. "I'll pick you up at 9 a.m. Just be yourself. That's more powerful than any speech or protest." After Shaq left, Martha called James to tell him about the visit. James was amazed but concerned. "Are you sure you're comfortable with this, Ms. Wilson? It might create even more attention." "I wasn't raised to hide from problems," Martha replied. "If going back to that bank with Shaquille O'Neal will help other elderly folks get treated with more respect, then that's what I'll do." Meanwhile, across town, the bank's regional director paced nervously in his office. The viral video had reached corporate headquarters, and the CEO was demanding answers. Customer service complaints were flooding in, and several longtime clients had already closed their accounts in protest. The next morning, a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of Martha's apartment building. A few curious neighbors peeked through their windows as Shaquille O'Neal himself opened the passenger door for Martha. He helped her into the custom vehicle, carefully folding her walker and placing it in the back. Inside the luxurious SUV, Martha ran her hands over the soft leather seats. "My late husband Tom would have loved this car. He was always reading those automobile magazines." Shaq smiled as he navigated through the city streets. "Tell me about Tom." As they drove, Martha shared stories of her 51-year marriage, how they had danced at their wedding, raised 3 children, weathered hard times, and celebrated life's joys together. "He sounds like a wonderful man," Shaq said sincerely. "He was. And he wouldn't have stood for how that bank treated me either," Martha replied, a new determination in her voice. As they approached First National Bank, Martha spotted a small crowd gathered outside. Despite Shaq's promise of no media, word had somehow spread. Several people held signs supporting Martha. Smartphone cameras were already pointing toward the SUV. "We don't have to do this," Shaq said, noticing her apprehension. Martha straightened her back and adjusted her pearl necklace. "Yes, we do. Not just for me, but for every older person who's been made to feel invisible." Shaq nodded with respect. As he parked the SUV, he turned to Martha with admiration in his eyes. "Ms. Wilson, you might be half my size, but you've got twice my courage." The moment Shaq stepped out of the SUV, a wave of whispers and excited murmurs swept through the small crowd. At 7'1", he towered over everyone present, his broad shoulders and famous smile instantly recognizable. But today, his focus wasn't on being a celebrity. With surprising gentleness for a man of his size, he walked around to the passenger side and opened the door for Martha. "Ready?" he asked quietly, offering his massive hand. Martha took a deep breath and nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." With dignity and poise, Martha stepped out of the vehicle, her hand looking tiny in Shaq's protective grip. The crowd began to applaud spontaneously. A few people called out words of support. "We're with you, Martha." "You show 'em, ma'am." James pushed through the crowd to greet them. "Ms. Wilson, I'm so sorry about all this attention. I had no idea it would get this big." Martha patted his arm reassuringly. "Don't you worry, dear. Sometimes a little fuss is necessary to make things right." The three of them approached the bank entrance, with Shaq adjusting his long strides to match Martha's careful pace. Through the glass doors, they could see bank employees looking out with expressions ranging from confusion to alarm. One young teller appeared to be frantically making a phone call. As they entered, the busy bank fell silent. Customers stopped in mid-transaction, tellers froze with papers in hand, and even the security guard, the same one who had escorted Martha out days before, stood motionless, his mouth slightly open. Martha recognized the young teller who had refused her service. He was now trying to make himself invisible behind his computer screen. The manager who had called security was nowhere to be seen. Shaq's voice, deep and resonant, broke the silence. "Good morning. We'd like to speak with the branch manager, please." A nervous assistant scurried from behind the counter. "Mr. O'Neill, this is such an unexpected honor. Our branch manager is in a meeting, but—" "Then get her out of it," Shaq interrupted firmly but politely. "Ms. Wilson and I will wait." The assistant hurried away, leaving Shaq and Martha standing in the center of the bank floor, with James a respectful step behind them. Customers began whispering and taking discreet photos with their phones. Within minutes, a different manager emerged from the back offices, not the woman who had called security on Martha, but an older gentleman in a crisp suit with silver temples and a concerned expression. "I'm Thomas Baker, the regional director," he said, extending his hand first to Martha, then to Shaq. "I flew in from headquarters this morning. Please, would you both join me in my office?" As they followed him, Martha noticed framed photos on the wall showing the bank's history. One black and white image from the 1950s showed a much smaller building with First National Bank, where customers are family, painted on the window. Inside the spacious office, Thomas invited them to sit in comfortable chairs across from his desk. "Ms. Wilson, first let me say how deeply sorry I am for your experience. It was brought to my attention yesterday, and it does not reflect the values our institution claims to uphold." Martha nodded but remained silent, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Thomas turned to Shaq. "And Mr. O'Neill, thank you for bringing this matter to our attention in such a direct manner." Shaq leaned forward, his expression serious. "I'm not here for apologies. I'm here because when I was growing up, my mother taught me that how we treat our elders shows who we really are as people and as businesses." For the next 20 minutes, Shaq spoke thoughtfully about community responsibility and the importance of balancing security protocols with human decency. He never raised his voice or made demands. Instead, he shared stories about his own grandmother who had struggled with memory issues in her later years, about communities where elders were treasured rather than inconvenienced. "Your bank has a choice," Shaq concluded. "You can hide behind policies, or you can lead the industry in showing how financial institutions can protect assets while respecting human dignity." Throughout Shaq's conversation, Martha sat quietly, her back straight, her expression calm but determined. When Thomas finally turned to her, she spoke simply. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for sensible treatment. There's a difference." Thomas nodded slowly, seeming to truly hear her words. "Ms. Wilson, you've been banking with us for 32 years, Martha finished for him. "Since 1992, when my husband and I moved to the neighborhood. Back when Mr. Grayson was manager and knew every customer by name." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, recognition, perhaps even sadness for what had been lost. He reached for his phone and pressed a button. "Patricia, please bring me Ms. Wilson's account history. And ask Lawrence from security to join us." While they waited, Thomas explained that he had started as a teller himself back when banking was more personal. "Somewhere along the way, we lost something important. Your situation has made that very clear." When Lawrence, the security guard from Martha's previous visit, entered the room, he looked nervous, but Thomas simply asked him to sit down. "Lawrence, I'd like you to be part of this conversation about how we can do better," Thomas said kindly. Because this isn't about blaming individuals, it's about fixing a broken system. As the meeting continued, Martha felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She hadn't come for revenge. She had come for respect, not just for herself, but for everyone who might find themselves in her situation. And sitting there, watching these men discuss real solutions with genuine concern, she knew her dignified stand had been worth it. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Thomas Baker's office as their meeting continued. Patricia had returned with a thick folder containing Martha's banking history, decades of consistent deposits, timely mortgage payments on a home long since paid off, and not a single overdraft in 32 years. Thomas flipped through the pages with growing respect. "Ms. Wilson, your banking record is impeccable. I'm even more disturbed now by how you were treated." Martha nodded graciously. "Thank you, but I'm not here to receive compliments on my financial habits. I'm here because no one should be humiliated for forgetting their ID once after decades of loyalty." Lawrence, the security guard, cleared his throat nervously. "If I could say something," when Thomas nodded encouragingly, Lawrence turned to Martha. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about that day ever since it happened. I was just following orders, but deep down, I knew it wasn't right. My own grandmother is about your age, and I kept thinking about how I feel if someone treated her that way." Martha reached out and patted Lawrence's hand. "You were doing your job, dear. It's the system that needs changing, not you." Shaq, who had been listening intently, leaned forward. "That's exactly the point. Good people working in broken systems end up doing things they know aren't right. So, what are we going to do to fix it?" Thomas closed Martha's file and set it deliberately on his desk. "I've been authorized by corporate headquarters to implement immediate changes. First, Ms. Wilson, we're establishing a legacy customer program for clients who have been with us for more than 20 years. He outlined the program, special identification options, alternative verification methods, and priority service. If a legacy customer occasionally forgets their ID, we'll have protocols for verification that maintain security without sacrificing dignity." "That sounds like a good start," Shaq acknowledged. "But what about the staff who humiliated Ms. Wilson? There needs to be accountability." Thomas nodded. "The manager involved has been temporarily reassigned pending completion of our new senior sensitivity training program." As for the teller, he hesitated. "Don't fire him," Martha interrupted firmly. "He's young. He needs guidance, not punishment." Thomas looked surprised but impressed by Martha's compassion. "In that case, we'll ensure he receives proper training. But there's something else I'd like to propose." He turned to Martha with sincere respect in his eyes. "Ms. Wilson, would you consider helping us develop our senior sensitivity training? Your perspective would be invaluable." Martha blinked in surprise. "Me? I'm just a retired school librarian." "Exactly," Thomas replied. "You've spent your life guiding young people. Now you could help guide our staff to better serve customers of all ages." Before Martha could respond, a commotion erupted outside the office. Through the glass walls, they could see the bank lobby had filled with people. Some held signs reading "Respect our elders" and "Banking with dignity." Local news crews had set up cameras near the entrance. Thomas looked alarmed. "I thought we agreed no media." "This wasn't my doing," Shaq said, looking equally surprised. "I specifically wanted this to be private." James, who had been sitting quietly throughout the meeting, sheepishly raised his hand. "I think this might be my fault. I posted an update that Shaq was helping Martha resolve her issue with the bank. I didn't mention which bank or when, but people figured it out." Martha stood up slowly, smoothing her dress. "Well, since they're all here, perhaps we should tell them what we've accomplished." Thomas looked uncertain. "Ms. Wilson, you don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," Martha replied with quiet determination. "Because this isn't just about me anymore. It's about every older person who's been made to feel invisible or burdensome." She turned to Shaq. "Would you mind standing with me?" Shaq smiled with admiration. "It would be my honor." Together, they walked out of the office and into the bank lobby. The crowd fell silent as Martha, barely reaching Shaq's elbow, stood beside him with dignity and poise. Thomas and Lawrence followed a step behind. "Thank you all for your concern," Martha began, her voice stronger than anyone expected from her small frame. "I want you to know that First National Bank has listened to our concerns today. Mr. Baker and his team are implementing changes that will ensure seniors like me are treated with the respect they deserve. She described the legacy customer program, emphasizing that the solution wasn't about special treatment, but about recognizing different needs. As she spoke, many in the crowd nodded in understanding and approval. Shaq then stepped forward, his commanding presence drawing all eyes. What happened here today is how problems should be solved, with listening, understanding, and concrete action. First National isn't just fixing one incident, they're changing how they serve their community. Her reporter called out, "Shaq, why did you get involved in this situation personally?" Shaq looked down at Martha with genuine affection before answering. "Because my mother taught me that true strength isn't about how much you can bench press. It's about standing up for what's right, especially for those who others might overlook." Thomas stepped forward next, addressing the crowd with newfound conviction. "Today marks a turning point for our bank. Ms. Wilson has graciously agreed to help us develop training for our staff on serving senior customers with dignity and respect. We're grateful for her willingness to turn a negative experience into a positive change." As cameras flashed and reporters called questions, Martha felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since retirement. What had begun as a humiliating moment had transformed into something meaningful, not just for her, but for countless others who might have faced similar treatment. Later, as Shaq prepared to help Martha back to his SUV, she turned to him with twinkling eyes. "You know, young man, I believe we've started something important today." Shaq grinned. "Ms. Wilson, I think you're absolutely right." 3 months had passed since that pivotal day at First National Bank. The summer sun shone brightly as Martha made her way up the newly installed ramp at the bank's entrance. She no longer needed to struggle with the heavy doors. They now opened automatically, a small but significant change that helped not only seniors but also parents with strollers and people with disabilities. Inside, the bank looked different. A comfortable seating area had replaced the cold, hard benches where customers once waited. A water dispenser offered refreshments, and large print materials were readily available. But the most noticeable change wasn't physical, it was the atmosphere. "Good morning, Ms. Wilson," called the young teller who had once refused her service. The transformation in his demeanor was remarkable. Where there had once been impatience, there was now genuine warmth. "How are your tomato plants doing?" Martha smiled. "Coming along nicely, thank you for asking. I might bring you some next week." This wasn't just friendly small talk. It was part of the new community connection approach that Martha had helped develop. Bank employees now made efforts to know their regular customers, especially seniors who valued personal relationships in an increasingly digital world. Martha walked to the special desk marked Legacy Customer Services. Here, long-term customers could handle their banking with additional assistance if needed. The program had been so successful that banks across the country were beginning to adopt similar models. "Martha, right on time for our meeting," Thomas greeted her, emerging from his office. In the months since their first encounter, he had become a true advocate for senior-friendly banking practices. "The board members are eager to hear about the next phase of our program." Martha nodded, feeling a sense of purpose that had been missing since her retirement. What had begun as a consulting role had evolved into a part-time position, senior community advocate. 3 days a week, she worked with the bank to improve services for older customers. Her modest salary supplemented her pension nicely, but the real reward was seeing the difference her work made. As they walked toward the conference room, Martha noticed a familiar face entering the bank, James, the teacher whose video had started it all. He waved enthusiastically. "I'll just be a minute," Martha told Thomas, making her way over to James. "Ms. Wilson, you look wonderful," James exclaimed. "The Banking with Dignity program is all over the news. They're saying it could become a national standard." Martha blushed slightly. "It's been quite a journey. How are your students?" "They're great. We've been using your story in our civics class to teach about standing up for what's right. The kids are inspired, especially knowing that Shaq got involved." At the mention of Shaq, Martha smiled. The basketball legend had remained true to his word. What could have been a one-day publicity event had instead become an ongoing commitment. Shaq had established the Respect Our Elders Foundation, with Martha serving on its advisory board. The foundation worked to improve senior services across various industries, from banking to healthcare to transportation. Last month, they had opened the first Golden Years Resource Center in the community, offering everything from computer classes to financial literacy workshops for seniors. The center had become a vibrant hub where older adults gathered not just for services, but for companionship and purpose. "Ms. Wilson, we should head in," Thomas reminded her gently. "The video conference with the other regional directors starts in 5 minutes." Martha said goodbye to James and followed Thomas to the conference room, where her presentation materials were already set up. On the wall hung a framed photo, Martha and Shaq cutting the ribbon at the Resource Center opening, surrounded by smiling seniors and community leaders. As banking executives from across the country appeared on the large screen, Martha felt a momentary flutter of nervousness. 3 months ago, she was just a retired librarian struggling to deposit her pension check. Now she was addressing bank presidents and directors about industry-wide reforms. "Ms. Wilson, we're ready for you," Thomas said, adjusting the microphone. Martha straightened her shoulders and looked at the expectant faces on the screen. She didn't need notes for this presentation, she spoke from the heart. "Good morning. My name is Martha Wilson, and I'm here to talk about the future of banking, a future where efficiency and humanity work hand in hand. 3 months ago, I was humiliated when I forgot my ID after banking at the same location for over 30 years. As she spoke, Martha saw heads nodding in understanding. The story of her experience, Shaq's intervention, and the positive changes that followed resonated deeply. It wasn't just about banking procedures, it was about recognizing the inherent dignity in every customer, regardless of age. When she finished her presentation, the questions came rapidly. How had the legacy customer program affected efficiency? What security measures ensured the system couldn't be abused? How were employees responding to the new approach? Martha answered each question with wisdom and clarity, drawing on her decades as a librarian and her recent immersion in banking operations. What she lacked in technical knowledge, she made up for in human understanding. As the video conference ended to enthusiastic applause, Thomas turned to Martha with deep respect. "You know, when we first met, I never imagined someone your age would revolutionize how we approach banking." Martha raised an eyebrow. "That's precisely the kind of thinking we're trying to change, isn't it, Thomas?" she said with a gentle smile. "Age isn't a limitation, it's an asset. I've had 78 years to learn what truly matters in life. It's about time everyone started listening." Outside the bank, life continued. But for thousands of seniors who would now be treated with dignity and respect in banks nationwide, everything had changed. All because one elderly woman had refused to accept disrespect, and a basketball legend with a heart as big as his frame had decided to stand beside her.